all the books off the shelf and she painted white stripes on the bookshelves to signify parking spaces. And they worked together to figure out which truck should go in which space, so he had some autonomy on the thing. And now all of a sudden at the end of his sessions, what does he do? He moves all the trucks into their appropriate spot on his parking garage. So notice what's going on here. Number one, we've increased his desire to clean up because we made it fun. Right? It's not a chore anymore. It's the conclusion of the play session. Number two, we increased the clarity. For a kid, clean up your room is a little bit abstract. But when we know, hey, cleaning up means taking all these trucks and putting them in the parking places that you assigned, we've added clarity to the mission. And the final thing is we've added ease. That bookshelf provided something physical in the environment that actually made this behavior change simpler. So do you see how those three elements interact? What we're doing is we're trying to systematically make the change we want easier. Okay, situation 2. Let's ramp up the stakes a little bit. Let's talk about hospitals. Every hospital in the country worries about hand-washing compliance. There are rigorous standards that say that the doctors and nurses must wash their hands between every single patient interaction. It could be 70, 100 washes a day. And it's really, really important because one of the biggest killers of people is preventable infections. And oftentimes those infections are due to poor hand hygiene. So even people who are well-intentioned and maybe washing their hands 80 times a day, if they forget once, that could be the one time that some germs spread between people and ended up hurting a patient. Okay, so we're clear again on the audience and the goal. Audience, doctors and nurses. Goal, increase compliance to hand washing standards. So now let's run this through the framework. How do we provide extra clarity? Well, you might say, it's pretty clear already, right? We need them to wash their hands between every patient interaction. And you're right, this is much more clear than most change situations are. But let's not jump too far ahead. What looks like resistance to change is often a lack of clarity. And so let's just be careful with ourselves. For one thing, the hand washing protocol is much more rigorous than like you and I washing our hands for dinner. It's you got to do one hand over the other and then each finger at a time. And so let's not jump to conclusions that all these caregivers know the best protocol. That's part of the clarity that we can add is how to wash hands, not to mention specificity about between every patient contact. More important in this case than clarity is desire. Because keep in mind, these people are saving lives. They're rushing around, and this can come to seem like bureaucratic work or just some awful chore. And so from time to time, smart hospitals have done a good job reconnecting the meaning of this chore to the ultimate goal, which is to save lives and prevent infections that might otherwise harm patients. So in some hospitals, they'll actually bring in patient families from someone with a loved one that's been hurt or even in some cases killed by a preventable infection to remind them, hey, this is why this is important. They're speaking to the elephant. In one case, they went into a meeting of surgeons and they had all the surgeons put their hand in an agar plate and then they sent those plates off to be developed, so to speak. And what came back were these just grisly maps of the colonies of bacteria that were on those surgeons' hands. So it's a way to use the power of disgust and kind of horror at your own hand hygiene to good effect. Those are ways of motivating the elephant and sparking desire. And then finally, and I might argue this is the most important part of this particular change mission, is how do we just make it easier for these caregivers? What does that mean? The most obvious way is there got to be sinks everywhere, right? You should not be able to walk 10 feet without hitting a sink or a flask of hand sanitizer. It's the same reason why at Disney World, there's a trash can every 50 yards. If you want clean streets, then you got to have ample places to throw away the trash. We might also find ways in the hospital to use positive peer pressure. That's another example of the path, something outside us. So in some hospitals, they actually track compliance, and so they can measure one department versus another. So again, we started with the behavior change goal, we put it through this framework, and we've done a lot of things just to increase the odds that we see good outcomes. I want to close with the third scenario. This is a big one. This was a national campaign to reduce homelessness called the 100,000 Homes Campaign, led by a change leader named Becky Margiotta. And Becky and her team, their mission was to change the behavior of local organizations and agencies that fight homelessness. So it might be people from the government, people from the VA, homeless shelters, people provide services to the homeless. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to create a new way of working to combat homelessness. So what's our mission? We've got an audience, local organizations and leaders who work on the problem of homelessness. And what's our goal? To get homeless people off the street. Now we've got to think through the framework. The first thing is, how do we direct the rider? How do we provide clarity? This was a hard part of the problem, right? Chronic homelessness has been with us forever, and people have tried countless things. And so it took them literally 5 to 7 years to come up with the right recipe for successfully getting chronically homeless people off the street. And in a nutshell, what they came up with was, number one, you go into a community at the local level and you do what's called a vulnerability index, which means you wake up in the middle of the night with a crew of people. You go, you comb the streets of your city, and you record every single person that you find, their name, their photo. You collect some information from them. You're basically creating a directory of all the homeless people in your town. And then you rank them from most vulnerable to least. And then you take those most vulnerable people, the people who could literally die in weeks or months if they're not provided with shelter, and you get them as quickly as possible into housing. They call it a housing first approach. So it took them years to incubate that approach and to figure out that it worked. But once they had it, now they have clarity, right? Now they can go to those local people in New Orleans and Phoenix and say, this is the way you can get homeless people off the street in the best possible way. How do we increase desire? How do we motivate the elephant? Well, the good news in this scenario is these were already pretty motivated people. I mean, their work, after all, was to help the homeless. And so we didn't have to start from scratch in this case. But I thought the 100,000 Homes team did a masterful job at reminding people of the meaning of the work. They had just the most amazing and kind of heart-wrenching before and after photos of people who had been found on the street, often homeless for decades, and then what they looked like subsequent to getting their own apartments or housing. So let me show you some of those. This is Ed from Los Angeles. He'd been on the streets for decades. He was a chronic alcoholic. And this is what Ed looked like after they put him into his own apartment. He actually had a chance to go with the 100,000 Homes team to the White House when they celebrated the end of the campaign. This is another woman named Donna. She was on the streets of Phoenix for many years. And this is Donna after she moved into her new apartment. She later joined the tenant board of that organization and is doing great. So that's a way to remind people of the why, the desire for this campaign. And then finally, if we ask ourselves, how do we simply make it easier? How do we shape the path for this? Well, what they taught these local communities to do was, number one, to map out the current process by which a chronically homeless person was put into housing. And what they created was these elaborate flowcharts. It might take 71 steps before you could actually accomplish that. And in a set of workshops, they worked systematically to streamline that, to take it from 71 steps, to 47 steps. That's a way of shaping the path for change. They also provided a lot of direct support, matching communities together, sharing best practices, getting on conference calls, having webinars, actually having an annual conference so they can physically get together. These are all ways of making it a little bit easier to accomplish this grand mission. So what have we seen? We've seen all change is ultimately behavior change. We've seen one of the core tensions of why behavior change is so difficult, this rider-elephant duality. We've seen a 3-part framework, and we've seen some examples of how to employ that framework. There is a lot more to say and learn. Some of my favorite parts of the book that I think are the most useful, like finding bright spots, shrinking the change, rallying the herd. I didn't have a chance to talk about any of it, but I hope you found this useful as a grounding in how to take those thorny, difficult change situations in life, get our arms around them, and make some good progress. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you found that helpful. Sorry that I hadn't had it fully downloaded before. Thank you very much for helping me out with that. Okay, so we will see you, Krishna willing, tomorrow morning. And please make sure you have the papers that we worked on today that we'll finish working on And then we're going to be working our own changes. Oh, and my friend, if you're interested in any of my books, so I have 3 books here. If you're interested, you can get them from Mahalakshmi, and I'd be happy to sign them for you. Hare Krishna.